incredibly foundational, sort of old school, but I'm very intentional with my calendar. So if I know that I have, a big meeting that I have coming up, it's not just going to be placed on my calendar. I'm going to make sure that I actually have dedicated focus time before that meeting in order to actually work on it. Because if I don't put it on my calendar, my calendar will get consumed by everybody else. And the thing that I've learned too is that you progress in your career and you get busier and busier, you take on leadership roles and so on. If you don't run your calendar, somebody else will. So I take very active, I guess, control, if you will, of my time and my calendar and where I spend it and what I do.
Hey, Tammy, it's good to connect. It's been a long time. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's really good to see you too, Paul.
So I'm gonna kick us off. I'm gonna actually share my screen and try to just read off, some of your top highlights from the early days. Just gonna read it back that, back in the day, your first role was marketing manager at Symbol Technologies, project manager then at Pearson, and then a really interesting stint where you were on the sales team at Responsys that then got acquired by Oracle. And we're going to dive into Oracle in that story. And then is it Xamarin?
Xamarin, yep, exactly.
Xamarin is where you got in and started building and leading teams. And that's acquired by Microsoft. And then where you and I worked together was, of course, the Double Dutch story. And that was a fun ride. And then Lever, definitely, I remember you leading out the team there in San Francisco. And that was the applicant tracking system. And then we'll skip ahead, to the end of it, and we'll talk about DocuSign, because just what a great kind of marker for everything in SaaS and everything in the past few years and the ups and the downs. Let's go back to early, like back when you first jumped in, out of high school, out of college. Let's start there, right? So did I read it right? Did you go to UC Davis? Are you a California Bay Area native? Like, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I did. I went to Davis, Bay Area, California native, grew up in the South Bay. Obviously didn't go very far for school. Always, I think I knew kind of that I wanted to work in or around tech just simply because I grew up here, not because I necessarily had any connections. In fact, I didn't. But just, you sort of grow up in this climate. So I thought that might be the path that I went in. And Davis wasn't particularly like a strategic move. It was sort of like, okay, cool, they accepted me, seems like a good school, I'll go there. And even now looking back, it was just such a great, like, I still very much now keep in touch with many folks from Davis, professionally and personally.
That's great. Did you know, were you a part of like when is UC Davis the viticulture and like the wine school
Oh
and
yeah,
was that?
yeah. I actually took a viticulture class. I didn't, major in it, but yeah, Davis is like a super sort of like agricultural, and it's well known actually for its agriculture program and veterinary practice. Neither of which I entered into, but probably should have. But yeah, there is a viticulture class. There's tastings. It's pretty cool for a college program.
It's I've heard a lot of good things, and I mean I live up there in the wine country, so
Yeah.
I'm a fan. So okay, well, great to talk with you. So take us through, that first role. So you wanted to get into marketing. What was that first role?
Yeah, when I got out of school, the vast majority of everybody I knew was going into some sort of finance role or consulting. Um, it wasn't for me, and for me, I thought, well, marketing seems like that's pretty fun and is like a good sort of like entry into any company that could be transferable. So yeah, I started at a company called Symbol Technologies way back when, and that was during the 2001.com. I felt very lucky at that time to even get any sort of job post school, and I did like website updates. I did, went to events and helped out with our events team. I also helped, just copywriting and proofreading with press releases, sales support materials. It was a little bit of like a jack of all trades sort of role. And I think at the time was really perfect to just sort of like give me an initial glimpse and entry into corporate life.
Gotcha. Okay. And then what about the step from marketing to sales? Like
Yeah, that's the
energy,
best story. So after Symbol, I went on to Pearson, which is a small boutique agency. And part of what we did at Pearson, I was a project manager there. And so what I did at Pearson was we worked really closely with a bunch of, and these are sort of like back in the day, legacy technology companies, HP, Sun, Cisco, Interwoven, like just sort of, names back then that you might recognize. And we supported these companies with a bunch of sales materials. So playbooks, collateral, that sort of thing. And so I got a lot of exposure to salespeople back then, just by the very nature of what I did. And it's interesting because doing that didn't necessarily convince me that that was the thing I wanted to do. In fact, I actually felt like there's a very specific persona, if you will, that a salesperson is, and I don't necessarily relate to that. So, after Pearson, I actually took a little break. I took a little break, and, I think in the long run, it was one of the best things I could have ever done. I just sort of started exploring different careers. I felt, for various reasons, like, I'm not sure this is what I want to do long term. I'm not really sure. Marketing seemed fun initially out of school, but I'm not really sure this is the thing I want to do. I don't know what I want to do. I thought even into like going into like, hospitality or like events or something along those lines. I started interviewing people, like people that I went to college with from Davis, and seeing, okay, what are you doing? And I had a lot of friends who were in various sales professions, not all tech sales, but like somebody was like in med device sales. Somebody else was like in pharma sales. Somebody else was like selling like e-discovery solutions to law firms. And finally, a couple buddies, like a really close college roommate of mine, she was like, Tam, you should really think about sales. And I almost felt like, that's not me. Like, I don't like to talk about money. I'm not aggressive. Like, I don't identify with that kind of role. And, to be quite honest, Paul, like I didn't have a lot of role models, that I could sort of like look up to that I identified with, certainly not women. And anyway, one thing led to another. And I thought, you know what, I'll just give it a go for a year, see how it goes, see what I think. Risk profile back then was low, so I went for it and became an SDR at Responses.
You said something interesting about back when you were kind of building out your career, like there weren't a lot of role models. And I think things have, shifted. It feels like there's a tide, but there's probably people out there who still feel that it's just hard to find a role model. If you're like, someone who's looking for a role model, is there a good place where you would just say, start looking, or, start with this community?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, Paul. It's something I feel really deep about because of how I started and how I felt when I started. And I really do want to sort of extend that to others who are looking to break in. Like I said, even though I grew up here, I didn't have any connections whatsoever going forward or coming into this. I would say to anyone who's looking to break into tech, it is a much more open and inclusive environment than it was back when I first started. And don't feel like because you don't have connections or you don't even have experience or knowledge of tech, that it's a barrier. In fact, as long as you come in with an open mind and an eagerness to learn, that will open a lot of doors for you. And of course, get out there and network and meet people, listen to podcasts and educational content such as this, so that you can learn new perspectives and be able to find your way in.
Can you just tell us a little bit about, when you became leading a team, leading managers, just what that kind of felt like?
Yeah, well, so at Responses, I was a first line leader. I went from being an AE to a first line leader, and I was there for a total between Responses and Oracle for about 7.5, 8 years or so. I would say, because this will influence my story later on, but Responses was a really formative time for me in my career, mainly because obviously it was my very first sales job. It was my first time carrying a quota, and having that. But also because the company grew tremendously and scaled in the time I was there. I was employee number 150 at Responses. And we went to being like, I don't know, a 1,500 person company, $2 billion run rate, getting acquired by Oracle. And despite the incredible hypergrowth during the time I was there, we were a very, very functional and well-run go-to-market organization. And I know people don't like, you don't hear that very often these days. And we sort of had this group between sales, marketing, pipeline, sales ops, rev ops, CS. Like, it was a very efficiently run and functional and fun time. And so for me, I think I really sort of like got a really extremely solid foundation. It unfortunately colored my experience for future roles, because I thought it was just always like this. But that was incredibly educational and grounding, if you will, for me, and just gave me like the best sales education I could have possibly gotten. I had great leaders there. It was just a really good experience. And so, yeah, going back to your point, that's when I also made the move from being an SDR to an AE to then a frontline leader. And so I really sort of like got, my career just sort of like took a really fast pace during that period.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about the, like, when there's a synergy, or when all of like the rev ops and the tech team and the marketing and the sales, like when everyone's, like, the best moment I remember is once the CTO at PandaDoc pulled up this graphic, and it was like one slide was a target with all these arrows that were all missing and, all over. And then it showed another picture of a target with all the arrows kind of all hitting the exact same spot. Yeah. So everyone was aimed at the right timing, the right moment, and the right direction. And like when everyone does that, like, it just feels so much more fun, and you can go so much further.
Yeah, that's a great visual. That's exactly how it felt. We were just all pointed in the right direction, and it was very much like, and even again, sometimes that kind of falls apart as the company grows. We also went public during that time too, before the acquisition, right? And so sometimes that falls apart when you grow that quickly, but it didn't. In fact, we were somehow able to lock that in and scale it.
So my next question is a lot of people haven't gone through an M&A or a private equity, or a going public and then an acquisition. So if you're working at, a private SaaS company right now,
yeah,
the writing's on the wall that next year there could be a lot of M&A and a lot of, good SaaS companies that are going to get acquired. And so it gets announced, you get the email, it hits TechCrunch, or it's on, PR Newswire. Like, what are you going to go through? What happens when this happens?
Yeah, I think the first thing I say is don't panic, because that's usually where people's minds go. And then once you get over that hurdle, and look, obviously the M&A environment and exit market was very different back then than it is, to your point, the circumstances of 2023 will be very unique. So the thing I would say is, yes, it's a change, but I would look at it with a sense of curiosity before making any sudden moves. You don't know yet how things will go. It could be, it'll be a cultural experience as you get absorbed into a new company, but it'll be one of the best learning experiences you've ever had too. And it's worth sticking around at least a little bit to see how it could play out. It could very well maybe be tough from a company standpoint, but it might benefit you individually, kind of depending on where things stand. You might get a really advantageous comp plan. You might get the opportunity to move into a different leadership role. So I would say, just sort of approach it with some flexibility and instead of fear.
I think that's really sage advice. Now, move us to kind of the product-led growth. So the PLG conversation that's just been happening so much.
Yeah.
But would you say was Lever, or in parts of the DocuSign world, like which one of your most recent roles would you say you kind of saw the laying of the foundation for product-led growth? Or did one of your teams have, more of a PLG slant?
Yeah, I would say Xamarin certainly did. So Xamarin was a developer tool, and it was, it was very easy to buy and transact. It was a very self-service sort of tool. DocuSign obviously very much is so. I would say, I think in my experience and seeing, between some of the various PLG companies that I've been at, but also just observed, is I think where a lot of companies struggle and have challenges with, but can overcome, is bridging the gap between PLG and direct. Like, there's always going to be a little bit of natural tension there And that's okay, so long as the company kind of figures out and understands what the customer journey looks like, and then builds that into the model and builds that into the go-to-market model. There is absolutely a harmony where PLG and direct can play together, and even like, layering partners and channel together on top of that too. So I know it's like we call it PLG these days, but the idea and the notion behind it has been around for a long time. Companies like Slack and Atlassian obviously have taken great advantage of it.
I like that phrasing about harmony, because it makes you just think about, like a different recipe or a different song. Like there's different analogies where it's about layering and it's about timing and it's about, it has to work together. It has to go.
Yeah.
What would you just define, product-led growth, PLG? Have you heard a really good definition, or how would you describe it to somebody who's just
that's a good, I don't know if I've heard a really good definition. So let me just make one up on the fly here, Paul. Okay, product-led growth, I would say I would define it as product market fit that allows a customer to buy in the way and the channel and the way that they'd like to buy. I think that's part of it. I hope I don't get grilled from my marketing team. Something along those lines.
I think you're getting into a key area of it. And yeah, I don't think there's a perfect definition, but the more I have these conversations, I think we're going to get closer. So what about the flip side? So I always hear this story. When I talk to people about PLG, they say, but there's going to be some companies that it just doesn't work. And they always say, look at Workday. You can't do PLG with HR. What do you think? Like, are there some companies where PLG just, it ain't going to fly? Or do you think pretty soon every SaaS company, no matter how big and bulky and burdensome the implementation, they will find a way to make it a PLG? Like, what do you think?
So, yeah. So I think there are I don't think it's a company thing. I think it's a product thing, right? So there are certain products, like, yes, of course, like Workday is a big enterprise product that requires enterprise-wide deployment and implementation, and a heavy CS team and a heavy implementation team to get that off the ground. But I think there are elements that maybe a company like Workday or an even bigger company could eventually initialize within the product that customers can then transact on their own. I don't know what that might look like, but I think every company should explore what that might look like, because it's going to be incremental revenue. It's going to be incremental revenue. And we're moving into a world where consumers are used to just doing things on their phone via apps and not having to talk to someone every single time. So I don't think it's a company thing. I think it's a product thing, and that companies should carefully inspect and look at what things they can introduce via product-led growth. And it could even be like a pilot sort of thing that they pilot via PLG to see how it plays out and to see what the demand for it is.
I really like how you're talking on it. I'm curious, like, where an AE and a CSM, and does it start to ever blur, or do roles start to change from what we know? And so I just wanted to hear, how do you guys talk about it at DocuSign?
Yeah, so one motion that's fairly significant for us is actually our direct. It's where our PLG and direct teams meet. So we have different types of books of business depending on segment and motion, or vertical, I should say. But we do have a significant part of our business that is PLG based. So customers that have transacted and bought on their own self-service DocuSign accounts via our website, and we specifically have certain teams that will go and pursue those accounts, simply because, we can see that they have potentially more use just based on, a certain profile of the company or profile of the persona that we're talking to, that they could do much better and be better served by us through a corporate plan. So there is actually a motion built out around that, in addition to other motions that are more sort of like install focused, where the AEs might be working with a CSM or a renewal manager. And that's, like I said, it's highly dependent on the size of the company and what segment they fit in.
So this is the investing corner. Money, finance, we can go as deep or we can move right along. But my first question is, is there anything you've picked up from the acquisition world, or when your ISOs and your ESOPs become, a public company and you're getting grants? And could you tell us about the Oracle moment or just the DocuSign moment? Like, I think that's a question a lot of people, they've never gone through it. So is there any guidance you can give? Like what happens?
So typically through an acquisition, there's not a lot of I don't want to use the word options because I know that means different things, but you're sort of funneled into one direction, which is that usually your options get turned into grants, actual grants. That's kind of usually how it works. I would say, so again, and there's not always a lot of leeway on whether or not you can do anything with that. It just also depends on like how far you invested and how deep you are in that journey. What I would say about just investing too is, I'm been really eager to talk to you about that too, because that's an area that I'm starting to get into and have dabbled a little bit in 2022 and looking to do more of in 2023. But it's something, having been on the operating side the entire time, like it's fascinating to me to sort of apply a different mental model to companies when looking at it from an investing standpoint.
Okay, well, let's dive in. I mean, so maybe just before we talk about the next couple of years for you, what about just historically, how have you had a investing strategy or a finance strategy? Like, has it evolved over the years, or just what would you say? What is your investing strategy?
It's nascent. So I have invested in a couple companies. Some have been direct, some have been through a fund, some have been through syndicates. And then I also done a little bit of real estate investing too. So I think, and then sort of like typical, market investing and index funds and things like that. I would say, if I've had any big lesson is I wish I would have just started earlier. I think in the beginning, it just feels you're so focused on your career. You're so focused on like what's going on in front of you. And in my case, also building a family, that you just sort of, leave it to later. And I think, for me, if I had any sort of big takeaway that I think would benefit people is start early, even if it's just a little bit. And again, starting doesn't necessarily mean quite literally deploying capital, right? Start learning. Just start having conversations, start talking to people, start consuming content around it, just so that you can at least be exposed to it and learn some of the vocabulary and some of the concepts. So that's probably, some advice that I would give to others.
What about for people so I think a lot of the listeners are probably like account executives, SDRs, sales managers, VPs, and then a lot of founders too. So in a couple episodes, we talked about setting up the 401k, and I talked about like that's kind of the first step but even in your 20s, it can be scary to be, clicking up on the contribution percentage. Like, should you do 6%, 8%, 12%? All of a sudden you're like, wait, I want that money. Like, I want to use it to go
and
out
and travel. Nowadays, probably seeing it trend down after you've just, put in 6%, 12%, whatever it might be. Right. But I think, if you are earlier in your career, time is on your side and you have time to sort of like let the market play itself through. Obviously, if you're later in your career and those funds are necessary for other things, that's a slightly different story. But if you are at a place where you can quite literally afford to have a bigger, longer timeline in front of you, you just sort of have to put it in there and let it ride. And that doesn't just apply to 401k, but like, index funds and things like that too. The other thing I would say is, don't forget to actually allocate your 401k. A lot of people have made that mistake where they just like put their money, like allocate their paycheck to the 401k, but forget to actually invest it in something. And your company will have, other resources that can help you do that, or ask a buddy, to help you pick something. But you've got to actually, once it doesn't just like magically grow in a 401k, it has to be invested in something. Don't forget to do that, everybody.
I'll put a screenshot in the blog that comes with this, because I think my wife has done that same thing for multiple years and it sat there, and I get it. So we'll cover that step. So this is, maybe it's not relatable, but I kind of think, how we always talk about your pipeline health and your pipeline composition, like in sales, you should have a couple big deals and a few mid steady. So however you think about it, that's like having a healthy pipeline. Do you think about something like that with your, you've got your retirement account, you've got your stock market, just standard stock, equity, S&P 500, that investment, and then you've got real estate, and then you're starting to do these angel and investing in individual companies.
Yeah.
Do you think of it like a pie chart, or do you think of it like, here's my big whale deal, and here's my run rate deals? Like, how do you think about it?
I do sort of think about it, and it's an active conversation that we have, in our family with my husband. The thing is, so yes, we do think about it in sort of percentages and how much risk we're willing to take on. And so each time we do something, it's like, okay, what's our liquidity on this? As far as like, if we needed that money for whatever reason, could we get it out, or is it stuck there for 10 years? And so we also think about it as far as timeline too, right? So not just amount, but also what's available to us within a certain amount of time. Because that's important depending on, whatever goals or timelines you might have. So we do think about that. And I don't remember now, even off the top of my head, what our allocations are. But yeah, there's a diversification across assets, but there's also diversification across like risk profile too. And, I wouldn't say anybody, if somebody does, please share that with me, but has cracked the nut on like, where do you place your big bets? Because where somebody might do big bets might be where somebody's like, oh, that's my risky part of my portfolio, So I think that's the secret, is trying to figure that part out. And I don't have the answer.
A couple syndicates, and you talked about leading or dropping in an angel investment. Can you just give us, how did you first get into that, or what are you now kind of thinking through for your next steps?
Yeah, so I joined a great organization called Hustle Fund earlier this year. I think it was actually very early in 2022. And for me, it was very much a first step. I think the thing that actually really attracted me to Hustle Fund was, they have kind of this no a-holes policy around investing. And it's like a everybody's welcome sort of policy too. So I didn't want to enter into something where it was just going to be a bunch of tech people, if you will, right? And I was going to be just sort of like the only novice one, like not being able to follow. And so Hustle Fund was a great foray into that, right? There's people from all over the world actually that come in. The initial deployment's reasonable. There's a ton of education. And for me, that was the number one priority. There's also, of course, access that you get to founders and to different deals that are available too. And so for me, it's always about content. It's always about learning, because then no matter what I do from that point on, that learning has been absorbed. Like that's the part, like you might kiss your funds goodbye or see you later, but the learning stays with you and you can apply that towards other things. So that's been really positive. I also just, had a founder friend who reached out, and I was interested in joining like a family and friends round that they had raised. So, that was sort of serendipitous. And then, I know you and I have had some separate conversations about 2023 that I'm excited for. And then the real estate thing is something that we'd always talked about and discussed. But there's so many different types of real estate investing. I mean, once you open that hatch, like it's just, there's so many different things. So I think it's about whether you're interested in being a passive investor, an active investor, and actually owning homes and having property ownership and all of that. Like, but everyone sort of has to find what's right for them based on their specific lifestyle.
I like that a lot. And yeah, this year has been my kind of, just like graduating college, and you go out in the workforce, and it's like you have no view of what are the paths. Like you don't know the steps that if you want to become a CMO, then you go down this cobblestone pathway and you follow all these little steps to get. Now I'm in that same moment for me, kind of the venture world and the LP world. So I'll try to give everyone like a snapshot of Hustle Fund. Sounds like a great one. I remember talking with Scott Barker at GTM Fund, and that's a collection of like 200 folks who are operators, and they all get together and there's learning, and they do a fund that's investing through them.
Yep.
And then you and I talked about Stage 2 Capital, which is a really good one that I just feel fortunate. Like they let me in, and they've kind of been, teaching me up on all the processes. So aside from that, I think there's, Pavilion has a big following on LinkedIn, or I see all these great people who are part of Pavilion. So they might be teaching a little bit or having courses on that. But if not, I'll try to share out a few more resources. But I think what you're saying is spot on, that you don't have to invest first. You can find these resources and read about, how does it work, and what's the time horizon. Like, I think it's useful to know, like, I think most of these investments are like 5 to 7 year, periods, right? Like, these aren't quick bet plays. These are,
Exactly.
if you help a friends and family round, like, that might be 9 to 10 years until
That's
that
right.
company has really matured. So you have to know that. So I'm going to swing us completely over to the new technique section, where we just ask about, is there a tool, like a business tool or a personal app or a personal tool, or is there something you've been trying to get into lately or you've been using that's been really interesting?
Not particularly. I will say I'm not really newfangled when it comes to that. But what I will say, I'm actually looking at my phone right now. It's just sort of like my own wellness apps. So I'm a big sort of like fitness and wellness person. For me, my daily quote unquote hack, if you will, is I have to move in the morning. I have to do something. So I usually do some sort of pretty extensive workout in the morning. I usually am up at like 5:30. And then I also am pretty active just throughout the day. I try to sort of like get outside at some point and do walking meetings also. Just for me, movement is a life hack. And it's something that, has been, actually, I mean, I've always been sort of an active person, but particularly during COVID, it really made all the difference. And so it's been, the last 3 years or so. I know, a lot of people have, other sorts of like things around time management. For me, again, it's incredibly foundational and sort of old school, but I'm very intentional with my calendar. So if I know that I have, a big meeting that I have coming up, it's not just going to be placed on my calendar. I'm going to make sure that I actually have dedicated focus time before that meeting in order to actually work on it. Because if I don't put it on my calendar, my calendar will get consumed by everybody else. And the thing that I've learned too is that you progress in your career and you get busier and busier, you take on leadership roles and so on. If you don't run your calendar, somebody else will. So I take very active, I guess, control, if you will, of my time and my calendar and where I spend it and what I do.
I love that hack about controlling your calendar. And the morning, I want to ask you a question. So I listened to, there's a podcast that I'm a big fan of. That's the Kleiner Perkins podcast. And they just sat down with the CMO, Linda Boff of General Electric, GE. So she apparently is one of these top CMOs. But in the podcast, she talks about how she wakes up at 5 a.m. and she has a cup of coffee and she goes on like a walk with her little dog. And from 5 to 6, she's like waking up, thinking. And then from 6 to 7 to 7:30, she's just doing writing. Like, she jots down like these, top internal memos or LinkedIn posts, or like the top, long form writing that she wants to get done. So for her, it was walking and always, but gee, that's just getting up so early. Like, I hate getting up early, but I'm starting to hear from you and, from other great folks that's like, when did you start waking up so early? Like, what made you kind of click into that mode?
Yeah, I've always, well, no, I haven't always been a morning person. It took time, Paul. Like, it really, really took time to get there. But now at this point, it's become breathing to me. And I don't, I don't drink coffee. I actually don't need it. When I'm up in the morning, I'm up. I'm ready to go. So I am like, more of my productivity is generated in like before noon. And so I know from like a creativity and prep and all that standpoint, I try to kind of like push all that up. So I have, the most brain power, if you will, during that time. But for me, and it sounds like, similar to Linda, like that morning time for me, whatever it might look like for different people, it completely sets the day for me. Completely sets the tone. It sets the energy. It sets the day. Like, I'll even feel a little bit off if I haven't been able to, for whatever reason, been able to get out there, if I'm traveling or whatever. I'll even, if I'm traveling for work, I'll travel the night before just so that I can be up and do my morning routine the next day rather than taking an early morning flight. So that's kind of like how critical it's become for me.
It's a sacred block in your calendar, in your day. Do not DNB, do not book. Okay. So
it just sets me right. It sets me right.
I might have to start waking up earlier. I hate it. But I mean, now I wake up. I mean, we've got a 2-year-old, so like, I mean, I'm up early. There's no sleep.
It's different. It's different because I have kids too, but they're older, and in the early days, you're kind of not sleeping as well when they're around that age. So you're waking up out of necessity, not because you want to. It's because you're on someone else's timeline.
Yeah.
Your time will come soon enough.
I'll join you on the 5:30 a.m. workout calls. Like we can, I'll challenge you. I need it after these past couple of years. I need to get some movement going. So final question here to wrap us all up would just be, I like to know from your vantage point, you've seen a lot of sales cycles, you're in forecast calls, you're talking with your sellers and across the team. It seems like there's this idea of, do nothing is going to become still a top reason that deals are getting stuck or that companies are saying no. Yeah. So for 2023, if you're an AE or if you're a customer success manager and you're talking about your top accounts, is there something you would give as guidance? Like, how do you think through all those steps to why a company is saying, let's just do nothing, or let's just continue with the status quo?
So I've been having this conversation a lot. This is what I have sort of been advising and talking about. The climate has changed, not just for people who are sellers, but for people who are buying, right? For people who are buying, even if they've been at the company that they've been at for a while, the buying cycle and evaluation stages for them will be different than it was 3 years ago. So even they might not know their own approval processes, who the key decision makers might be. Maybe there's got to be new influencers that need to be involved as well. So I think we as sellers cannot assume that our buyers know their own cycle, which is crazy because then you're like, as a seller, which is like, well, then how do I figure this out? And what I would say there is I would say, if I was an AE and I was talking to you, Paul, I would say, hey, Paul, one of the things, and I would bring this up proactively. I wouldn't wait until there's a stall. I would bring this up proactively. And I would say, Paul, one of the things we've noticed in talking to other companies, just because of the macroeconomic environment right now, is that, companies are taking longer to make a decision. They're involving more people. And, we're just finding that cycles are elongating. And I know you've purchased software for your company before, but how do you think that might be different? How do you think that might be different? And how can I help you and your team make a decision within the timeline that we've discussed? And then the other thing I would say is, I also don't want you, Paul, to be afraid to come to me with not so great news, right? I want to work through it together. So if you're feeling like your team might be leaning away or might be hesitating for whatever reason, or might need more time, please don't go dark on me. Please tell me, I appreciate the updates regardless. So, I think that's all we can do as sellers. You just can't force it. You got to be customer centric. They're either going to buy or they're not going to buy it. It's oftentimes not directly up to the person you're Zooming with, right? But you have to ask. You have to ask, and you have to give them the ability to tell you no and to work through it together.
Yeah. I think that's such good advice that we're going to share out with everyone. Tammy, always fun to catch up with you, and I'm so glad that you ended up getting into sales and you kept going and kept building because, no, seriously, you're a role model for a lot of folks, and hopefully at the next window that opens up, give me a call and I'll be on your team whenever it works out. So.
Well, I think we'll be talking a lot more in 2023, Paul.
Okay. Sounds good, Tammy. Take care.
Sounds good. You too.